Industrial Sabotage in Devon by Mark Spruce, written in 2019. It's sometime in March 1983 and I'm driving my mother's old Vauxhall Estate car down a ridiculously narrow Devon lane on my way towards the main road in Oakhampton. The road is full of potholes, but there's no space to avoid them as the car is corralled in by the high banks. The wipers work valiantly to keep the windscreen clear, and I have the headlights on full beam, trying to see as far ahead as I can into the pitch darkness. It's 5:30 on a Monday morning, and as the heater finally begins to warm the car's interior, I reflect on how I came to be in this particular place at this particular time. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had been working as a telephone debt collector along with many others in a huge open-plan office overlooking North Harbour, Portsmouth. Officially, we were credit control clerks, and along with several other underemployed graduates, we spent our days on the telephone trying to contact the recipients of our company's computer service contracts. Our task was to attempt to persuade them to pay their bills early. Verbal abuse came as standard on many occasions, and sensitive young skins thickened quickly. I was employed on a 3-month contract by Brook Street Bureau and had cycled daily up through Portsmouth from my bedsit in Southsea to be taken the last few miles by Works minibus to the secure and rather sinister Black Glass complex. Along with hundreds of others, I passed daily through the security doors at the building's entrance. My electronic tag was swiped, ladies' handbags were checked, and we walked en masse into the building. It felt at times like the opposite of prison day release, and it's no wonder that a few student colleagues referred to IBM as Inside Broadmoor. These were the early days of computers, and we were closely monitored in every aspect of what we did. The calls we made, the length of calls, when we went for breaks, the lengths of our breaks, and so on and so on. When my contract came to an end, I was more than happy to leave. All my student colleagues had left the previous summer at the end of our degree course, and I really had nothing to keep me any longer in Portsmouth. It was time to return to my parents' home in Devon and decide what to do next. At 21, I certainly didn't want to go back to live with my parents, but by chance my mother had come up with a temporary solution. She'd bought a large static caravan the previous summer for children to stay in on the pony trekking holidays she organised. The caravan at the rear of her stables was still empty, it being too early in the season for holidays. This is where I could move to whilst I sorted out my future. I left Portsmouth filled with much loss and regret, but knew I had to keep pushing on until I found something suitable in the way of employment and a proper future somewhere. This was always going to be a temporary sojourn. So it was that a few days later I found myself perusing the boards of cards in the Oakhampton Job Centre when a particular one caught my eye. It read, "Dairy worker, North Taunton, alternate weekly day and night shifts. No experience necessary as training provided on the job. Temporary contract, immediate start, £125 a week." The job was paying a terrific wage for the time, and it certainly looked ideal as a temporary employment solution. A 6 o'clock start seemed really early, but with the naivety of youth, I was sure it would not be too much of a problem. The interview had been perfunctory. I was offered the job as I had the requisite number of limbs and could get to the remote rural factory under my own steam at an hour before any local buses ran. So here I was the following Monday, heading for my first day's employment as a dairy worker. The rain continued to pour as I turned into the gates of the factory. I felt wide awake on a mixture of adrenaline and anxiety as I found a place in the car park and hurried swiftly across the forecourt along with the other early shift workers. The harsh neon lights of the entrance hall seemed even brighter in contrast to the darkness outside. This was yet another new and alien world I was entering. I briefly watched a line of workers queue up to take their brown name card from the slot on the wall. Each would then dutifully insert it into the punch card machine and clock on before passing through the double doors on the right into the factory proper. As previously instructed though, I passed through the door on the left and climbed the stairs to the shift manager's office. At the top of the stairs I knocked on the door to my right and received an immediate and barked, "Come in!" I opened the door to be met by a man who looked to be in his middle 40s. He was wearing white overalls, white trousers, white Wellington boots, and under a white hat he wore a blue hairnet. He managed half a smile as he rose from behind his desk. He looked rather stern in fact, but that might just have been due to the earliness of the hour. Following the briefest of introductions, I was taken back downstairs to the entrance hall, where I was taken through the clocking in and clocking out procedure. We then passed through the double doors and along the neon-lit corridor to the staff changing area, and here I was shown my battered grey locker. I took off my coat, put on the dairy overalls and steel toe-cap boots I was offered. I was beginning to feel increasingly like just another processed minion in my identikit uniform. I already felt partly absorbed into the alien factory process. It felt like I was 1,000 miles from my warm caravan bed, and it was only 6:30 in the morning. We left the changing room and continued down the corridor into the heart of the factory. As we walked purposely along the tiled floor, I was shown various rooms, including the staff canteen, the cheese production area, and the lab. I was told lab workers do not start work until 8 a.m, and I got the impression from the shift manager's tone that they were far more superior in the hierarchy than us mere dairy workers. Finally, at the far end of the corridor, we passed through another set of double doors, straight into the enormous, high-ceilinged warehouse that had the vast proportions of a cathedral. Thinking back, I'm sure it wasn't quite as big as that, but at the time, the sharpness of contrast with the brightly lit corridor seemed very striking indeed. Across the wide concrete floor space, I could see stacks of brown bags on pallets. The pallets were stacked at least 30 feet high, and hundreds of them filled 1/3 of the warehouse space. As I stood for a second taking in my new work surroundings, a forklift truck loaded with pallets hummed its way past in front of me. I watched as it approached a lorry already partly filled that had reversed in through the large double-doored road entrance at the far side of the warehouse. In a second, though, the shift manager had ushered me on to the opposite side of the warehouse, through yet another door into what I presume was to be my new place of work. In front of me was a knee-high conveyor belt, with space on it for, I would guess, 4 men to stand reasonably comfortably side by side. The belt ran from right to left, and at the left end it ran underneath some kind of machine with vicious-looking jaws. Above the right end of the belt and suspended on a frame was a large metal hopper that funneled down to a hole around 8 inches in diameter. The hopper funnel was directly above the belt, and I noticed the exit hole had 2 paddles either side of it. I barely had time to take in the scene before me when 4 older men suddenly filed into the room behind me, all dressed identically to myself. The shift manager introduced me to the rest of my shift team, who all seemed to speak to the manager in deferential terms. I was left in no doubt of the managerial hierarchy in this factory, on the surface at least. My new colleagues ranged in age from mid-40s to early 60s. 3 of them had apparently been farm workers of various kinds. The eldest was Polish and had settled in the area after service in World War II. Introductions over, the shift manager confirmed the day's production target figures in a perfunctory way with the shift leader Bill, and then made a swift exit back the way he had come. From the moment I had left my parents' home at 5:30 a.m. up until this point, everything I experienced had been new and rather intimidating. The atmosphere changed though immediately the shift manager had departed through the door. "Grumpy old bastard," said Bill in his thick Devon accent, looking towards the door. The other men laughed heartily, shook my hand in turn, and I felt for the first time the warm camaraderie of the shift. Whilst the others stood around chatting, Bill led me over to the far side of the conveyor belt, behind a large three-sided bin, and introduced me to my task for the shift. On the floor before me, I saw a freestanding metal hoop about 4 feet tall, and beside it were stacks of two kinds of bags, one plastic and the other of coarse, thick brown paper. Bill showed me how I should take one plastic bag in turn and slide it over the hoop. I would then pick up one of the paper bags and slide this one over the plastic bag. I should then take both bags off the hoop together, one inside the other, and stack them in the three-sided bin at the end of the conveyor belt. So, that was all I had to do. Apart from tea breaks and lunch in the canteen, I performed this task hundreds of times over the course of the next 11 hours. As the day wore on, I grew increasingly tired, and my feet ached incredibly. As 6 p.m. finally approached at the end of that first shift, I was physically exhausted and utterly brain dead. This job might pay £125 a week, but boy, I was going to have to earn that money. During our breaks, I'd found out a little bit more about my new colleagues, and despite being the new boy, was quickly welcomed into their world of highly irreverent male banter and humour. There were in fact 5 members of the shift team, the 5th member joining us from another part of the warehouse for our break. I quickly found out that this 5th member was leaving at the end of the week, and that I was in fact his replacement. As the week progressed, I gradually became familiar with the factory layout and began to settle in as a new team member. At 21, and as a graduate from another county, I was definitely a foreigner, though I was cautiously welcomed into the team. Driving home that first evening, I was so tired. It was all I could do to pull into my local pub for a tea of sausage and chips, accompanied by a couple of much-needed pints of beer. By the time I finally got back to my caravan at 8 p.m, I did little more than climb into bed, read my current book for a while, and set my alarm for 5 a.m. I fell into the deepest of sleeps until the harsh beeps of my alarm jarred me awake to begin the whole process once more. The rest of that first week of day shifts continued in the same exhausting, repetitive and unrelenting way. Everything, on the surface at least, seemed to have a strict order and hierarchy, both within and between departments. I noticed deference was shown to shift managers, department managers and factory managers at every level. I also noticed how the atmosphere changed immediately the shift manager came into our part of the warehouse. However, left to our own devices, the rest of the men slipped back quickly into an easy familiarity. By that first Friday, I had become reasonably accustomed to my new work routines, and I celebrated by getting monumentally drunk. Having worked a week of day shifts, the following Monday was quite strange, as I was not starting my shift until 6 p.m. I spent much of the day lounging around in my caravan reading my current book. It was called Shogun by James Clavell. The experiences of its Western narrator, Sea Captain John Blackthorne in 17th century Japan, seemed in some ways to parallel my experience of the new world of the Devon dairy worker. As the novel progressed, John Blackthorne, the foreigner like me, gradually became more used to the practices and customs of the new land in which he had found himself. He began to learn the Japanese language and understand the strict hierarchy of that society. At one point in the novel, he underwent a painful initiation ceremony. On that first night shift, unknown to me, I was about to experience my own unpleasant shift initiation custom. Apart from the time being different, everything else was by now familiar as I clocked on for my first night shift. On this day, though, I found I had now been moved onto the production line itself. As the shift began, Bill showed me the ropes for my first job, I was going to be filling the bags with milk powder before passing them along the conveyor belt. I'd take one of the bags with its plastic inner bag and offer it up to the base of the hopper. I'd then depress a foot pedal, and the two paddles would swiftly lock the bag into the hopper base, gripping the bag from front and back. The hopper nozzle would then lift up with the bag attached, and 56 kilograms of milk powder would be dispensed rapidly into the bag before it dropped back down onto the conveyor. I would then pass the bag along to the next person on the shift. Apart from making sure both the bag and the liner were securely in place before pressing the foot pedal, there was really nothing else to the job. After a slow start, I quickly got up to speed. Pick up bag, attach bag, press foot plate. Pass bag along, repeat. It was noisy, dusty, repetitive work, but I got into the routine and the bags started to move swiftly along the line. This process continued until 4 tons of bags had been packed. It was at this point everyone in the shift then moved along one place. The job so far had been very repetitive, but at least I had to maintain concentration as far as the bags, paddles and pedal were concerned. I now moved to the second job in the process. This job involved inserting my hand between the inner plastic bag and the paper outer one, and folding the plastic bag in a methodical and rapid way to a tapered point before passing it on again. The only issue with this job was the speed needed to keep up with the others, but after a further 4 tons I moved along once again. The third job was to use an instrument a bit like a pair of pliers. I'd place a small orange rubber ring over the end of the instrument. Compressing the handles then opened the opposite end with the ring on it, stretching it wide. I'd then put the stretch ring over the point of the plastic bag and push it down inside the paper one. This job required speed and dexterity to get the rubber rings on and off the pliers quickly, and for a while I was the slow point in the line, causing the others to cuss and swear at me for slowing down their rhythm. After another 4 tons, thankfully we all once more moved along one place to the left. This time my job was to receive the paper bag with the filled plastic bag inside and to pass it through the jaws of the stitching machine, which would seal the bag shut. Thankfully the machine had a guard on it, but this was the job I found most unnerving. The technique was to feed the bag into the jaws evenly, and to start with I produced several very unevenly stitched bags. Finally, and thankfully, I moved along to the final job in the process. The conveyor with the stitched bag on passed through a hole in the wall and out into the main warehouse. And here I had to take the bags off the conveyor belt and stack them onto a pallet. Once I had stacked a ton of bags, a forklift truck driver would take it away and another fresh pallet would be laid down for me to repeat, laying up a further ton of milk powder. This last job was by far the most exhausting physically, but by virtue of being in the main warehouse, I had some peace for a while at least from the general banter. Barring stops for meal and tea breaks, this process continued throughout the night, and by 4 a.m. I was feeling very tired indeed. One thing I'd become aware of quickly is that on the night shift there was only one manager on duty for the whole factory, and he only stuck his head around the door once all night. My shift colleagues all seemed a lot more relaxed, both on the line and in the canteen. The jokes and general banter, many at my expense, continued throughout the night. By 5 a.m. we were nearing our production target for the night, and I was absolutely exhausted. It was my turn to be at the head of the line once again to feed the bags onto the hopper when my unexpected initiation happened. I'd loaded several bags on virtual automatic pilot when I turned to my right to pick up yet another one. I was just turning back to the hopper when Bill moved swiftly to his right and stepped on the footplate. Before my dulled senses had time to react, the hopper had lifted up and 56 kilograms of dried milk powder dumped itself out all over me. I was completely covered in powder from head to foot, The others stood around laughing uproariously whilst I tried to brush this awful powder off myself, swearing at them profusely. I was angry and embarrassed in the same moment. I discovered immediately that milk powder reacted with the sweat on my face and hands and stuck to me like glue. I could taste the powder in my mouth and my nostrils filled with a sickly smell. In the end, once they'd all had their joke, they slapped me on the back and sent me off to the showers whilst they finished the last ton between them. So, I was now a fully initiated member of the shift, and it is a work incident I have honestly never forgotten. Work continued in this routine for the next couple of weeks. After 60 hours on night shifts, I drove home the following Saturday morning, barely hanging onto the steering wheel. On getting back to my caravan, I fell into bed fully clothed and did not stir again till mid-afternoon. One virtue of working so hard was that I had no time to spend much of my earnings, so my bank account at least quickly started to look a lot healthier. We were halfway through the following week of night shifts when the next incident happened. Due to the lack of management, the night shifts were always far more relaxed than the day shifts. This was also a long time before CCTV became commonplace in factories, which further added to the more laid-back atmosphere. It was around 3 a.m. that we reached our target for that particular evening, and by strange coincidence, the stitching machine broke down almost immediately afterwards. Well, of course, we all went for an impromptu cup of tea while waiting for the site mechanic to come and fix the machine. After an extended break in the canteen, one or two of the shift drifted off back to the warehouse. I presumed at the time they were going to chat with some colleagues elsewhere. Eventually, it was just Bill and I left in the canteen, and it was then that Bill quietly revealed what had actually been happening. Apparently, the stitching machine jammed quite often on night shifts, and always just after the shift target had been reached. Bill whispered that sometimes people got careless with screwdrivers and winked at me. So, this was deliberate sabotage. I was slightly shocked, but when Bill told me to slip quietly off, turn the bag bin round to face the wall and have a kip on the bags, I did not question him further. I'm not sure if I actually did fall asleep in the bag bin that night, but I was certainly very relieved to have 2 paid hours rest from the production line. Next thing I knew, the rest of the shift came back into our part of the building around 5:30 a.m. along with the site mechanic, and we awaited the clocking on of the day shift manager. During my time at the dairy, the stitching machine broke down on our night shift at least one night a week. I'd turn the bag bin around and settle down for a snooze, and the rest of the team would drift off into the factory somewhere. The work routine was tiring, but gradually I became accepted as part of the shift. I was so busy with work I'd not given a lot of thought to my future career plans, but was just living in the moment. Days ran into days, nights ran into nights. Some days I would drive home feeling elated from the camaraderie and would play my favourite cassette of the Foreigner 4 album loudly as I tore along the narrow Devon lanes. It was only much later the irony of that album title struck me. There were 4 of them, and I was the foreigner. As time passed, I noticed I was now driving home from my night shifts in early morning light. One Monday evening, though, I clocked on to be told this would be my last week at the dairy. I always knew this was going to be a temporary contract, but after 8 weeks at the factory, I'd slipped into a comfortable and stable routine. I really didn't want to leave. Bill and one of the other shift members would be given other jobs in the dairy. The other 2 shift members would be laid off like me and would probably look for summer seasonal farm work in the local area. The shifts that final week ran smoothly until Thursday. It was around 2 a.m. when one of the shift members stuck a large screwdriver into the stitching machine and it stopped with a jolt. By now, no one bothered to hide from me exactly what they were doing. I was a fully trusted member of the team, and in any case the following night would be my last shift. On this occasion, though, instead of going to nestle myself down in the bag bin, I was invited by Bill and the others to join them as they made their way out into the warehouse. I fell into line behind the rest of the men as we walked across the warehouse floor towards the huge wall of milk powder bags stacked on pallets. I presumed I was being invited to join them along with some other night shift workers for a smoke and a natter on the far side of the factory. I could not have been more surprised, therefore, when on reaching the far corner of the warehouse, the men turned themselves sideways and slipped one at a time down a narrow passage between the stacks of bags. Not wanting to be left behind, I also turned and slipped myself along the narrow gap between the bags. The path through the bags extended some 20 feet, I should guess, before turning suddenly to the left. I followed the last man around the sharp corner and was amazed to find myself coming out into the middle of a large space that had been left in the middle of the stacked bags. The space was well lit, being directly below one of the large strip lights high up in the warehouse ceiling. I stood at the entrance to the space dumbfounded as the 4 members of my shift exchanged greetings with 4 other dairy workers and sat down on small stools around a low square table. The first 4 men were already partway through a game of cards, and my shift joined them with an obvious ease and familiarity with their surroundings. So, this is where the others had been disappearing off to when the stitching machine broke down. I could scarcely believe what I was seeing, but I was welcomed in by the other men with barely a raised eyebrow. We remained in that hidden room amongst the pallets for the next couple of hours, laughing, smoking and playing cards. I've no idea how long that secret room had been in existence, or how on earth the men had constructed it and kept it secret from the managers. All I knew was that I felt like one of the naughty kids from school, and it felt wonderful in that moment to be part of the workers, sticking it to the management. I remember driving home that morning, realising I'd witnessed something unique in my working life up until that point. I suddenly laughed to myself when I thought about the contrast between working at the dairy and being a credit control clerk in Portsmouth. My working experiences up to the age of 21 had certainly been varied. I was now a shogun. The following evening, I clocked on as usual, and the shift continued normally, just like all the previous shifts, until about 5 a.m. On this last night, no one needed to sabotage the stitching machine. We'd reached our target for the night and had absolutely no intention of working for our last hour's employment at the dairy. It was too late by then to start a game of cards, so 3 of the shift members walked off to the canteen to make a cup of tea stretch for the last hour. Bill, however, asked me to follow him over to the far side of the warehouse. I asked where we were going, but he just repeated for me to be quiet and follow him. At the far wall, we started to climb an open metal set of stairs that were bolted to the warehouse wall. We climbed right up to the ceiling. I looked back briefly down across the great expanse of the warehouse floor and realised quickly that the space at the top of the secret room in the pallets could not be seen from this side of the building. Those workers were not daft, and I'm sure sighted their private space deliberately unseen from management's eyes. Just below the ceiling, the stairs levelled out onto a short gantry that led to a fire door. Bill pushed the fire door open, and I followed him through out onto the flat roof of the dairy warehouse. It was around 5:15 by this time, and the grey pre-dawn light showed me the full extent of our surroundings. I could clearly make out the darker shapes of the surrounding hills and Dartmoor in the distance. Bill walked across the roof to the eastern side of the building, and we sat down together at his invitation on the edge of an air vent to watch the sunrise. The air was mild for the time of year, and we sat there in silence for a moment, both of us rolling a cigarette. I was just reaching into my pocket for my lighter when Bill nudged me to look up. Just at that moment, the first of the sun's rays burst over the horizon, and in the time it took to smoke the roll-up, another day had dawned over Devon. I remember that as a serene and tranquil moment in my life. Bill told me it had been good to have me as a member of his shift and wished me luck for the future. I nodded my thanks and sat there in comfortable, comradely silence for a minute, just taking in the view and absorbing the moment. I would spend most of the next 3 decades in white-collar jobs. I'd attend management meetings, training days, team bonding workshops, and latterly spend many hours looking at spreadsheets on laptops. That short time at North Taunton Dairy, though, gave me some of the strongest memories I have from my working life. Through necessity, I'd found myself in a work environment for which I was overqualified. But at the dairy, I learned work is not just about the wage. Companionship, camaraderie, and a sense of belonging also have a value far beyond the monetary.
Spruce Casts, an eclectic collection of anecdotes, reflections and stories by Mark Spruce.